My name is Arthur Williams. I find myself reflecting on a life that's been anything but ordinary. For the past 15 years, I've worked as a park ranger in the dense, mysterious forests of Northern Idaho. It's a job that's brought me more joy, wonder, and yes, terror than I ever could have imagined. I suppose I should start at the beginning. I wasn't always a ranger. In my younger years, I worked in an office in Boise, pushing papers and dreaming of something more. It wasn't until my 52nd birthday that I decided to make a change. My wife, Sarah, had passed away a year earlier, and our children were grown with families of their own. I felt untethered, adrift in a life that no longer seemed to fit. It was during a camping trip in Clearwater National Forest that the idea struck me. I'd always loved the outdoors, and as I sat by my campfire listening to the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant call of a loon, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The next morning, I marched into the ranger station and asked about job openings. The transition wasn't easy. At my age, the physical demands of ranger training were challenging, to say the least. But I persevered, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. When I finally donned my uniform and ranger hat for the first time, I felt a pride I hadn't experienced in decades. Clearwater became my home, my sanctuary. I learned every trail, every stream, every rocky outcropping. I could identify dozens of bird calls, track animals through the underbrush, and navigate the forest in the darkest night. I thought I knew every secret these woods held. How wrong I was. It was in my third year as a ranger that the incident occurred. The one that still haunts me, that makes me question everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was 1998, a year that had started like any other, but would end up changing my life forever. The day it all began was unremarkable at first. It was early June, and we'd just come out of a week of heavy rain. I was assigned to check the lesser-known paths for storm damage, a routine task that I'd done countless times before. I woke before dawn, as was my habit. My small cabin on the edge of the forest was quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the old clock in the kitchen. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, its rich aroma filling the air as I prepared for the day ahead. As I sipped from my mug, I gazed out the window at the forest. The first hints of sunrise were just beginning to paint the sky, turning the sea of green treetops into a shadowy, undulating mass. I packed my gear methodically: first aid kit, trail maps, compass, radio, and of course my trusty rifle. We're required to carry firearms due to the wildlife, bears, mountain lions, and the like, though in all my years I'd rarely had cause to use mine. Still, it was a comforting weight at my side as I set out into the misty morning. The air was crisp and damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine. As I made my way down the main trail, my boots squelched in the mud, leaving deep imprints that would soon be erased by the passage of animals or the next rainfall. I radioed in my position to base camp, my voice breaking the early morning stillness. "This is Ranger Williams. I'm heading out to check the eastern trails for storm damage. Over." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. It was Marta, my colleague and friend. "Copy that, Arthur. Be careful out there. We've had reports of a few mudslides. Over." "Will do, Marta. I'll check in every hour. Over and out." As I ventured deeper into the forest, the familiar sounds of the awakening woods surrounded me. Birdsong filled the air, a melodious chorus that I'd grown to love over the years. Squirrels chattered in the branches above, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the distinctive sound of a woodpecker hard at work. The first few hours of my patrol were uneventful. I found a few downed branches and noted areas where the trail had been partially washed out by the heavy rains, but nothing too serious. It wasn't until around noon that I began to notice something. I had stopped by a small creek for my lunch break, sitting on a fallen log as I unwrapped the sandwich I'd packed. The burbling of the water and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze created a peaceful backdrop. But as I sat there, savoring my meal and sipping coffee from my thermos, I realized that something was missing. The birds had stopped singing. Now, to most people, this might not seem like much, but for someone who spends as much time in the woods as I do, it was jarring. The forest is never truly silent. There's always some ambient noise, be it wind or wildlife. But in that moment, it was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I set my sandwich down, suddenly alert. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of what might have caused this unusual silence. A predator, perhaps. But I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, undergrowth, and the quietly flowing creek. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. "You're getting jumpy in your old age, Arthur," I muttered to myself, forcing a chuckle that sounded hollow even to my own ears. But as I packed up my lunch and continued on my way, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the forest I thought I knew so well. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. I found more storm damage, a few downed trees and a small landslide blocking one of the lesser-used trails. I made notes of their locations, planning to send a crew out to clear them in the coming days. But all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was ridiculous, of course. I was alone in this part of the forest. No hikers ventured this far off the main trails, and my fellow rangers were patrolling other areas. Yet every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself gripping my rifle a little tighter than usual. As the day wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, I knew I should start heading back. But something compelled me to push on, to explore just a little further. That's when I came across the old logging road. It wasn't on any of the official maps, but we rangers knew about it. It had been abandoned years ago, left to be reclaimed by the forest. Weeds pushed up through cracks in the weathered asphalt, and young saplings had taken root along its edges. I'd been down this road a few times before, but something about it looked different today. There were marks in the mud along its edges, not quite footprints, but long, dragging impressions that I couldn't identify. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the old road, just for a little while. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees looming taller and the undergrowth growing thicker. The silence that had unsettled me earlier now seemed oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. That's when I saw it, a flicker of unnatural color through the trees. I moved closer, pushing aside branches, and found myself on the edge of a small clearing. In the center stood a tent, weather-beaten and sagging, its once bright fabric faded to a dull gray. A small fire pit sat nearby, the ashes within it still warm to the touch. My first thought was that it must be an illegal campsite. We occasionally had issues with people setting up camp in restricted areas, but something about this site felt wrong. The tent looked like it had been there for months, yet the fire was recent, and there was that symbol carved into one of the nearby trees, a circle with an X through it. I'd never seen anything like it before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is anyone here? This is Ranger Williams." No response came, not even an echo. It was as if the forest had swallowed my words. I approached the tent cautiously, one hand on my rifle. The zipper was partially open, and I could see a jumble of supplies inside. Old cans of food, a tattered sleeping bag, and what looked like a journal. I reached for it, my curiosity overriding my sense of caution. That's when I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. The journal lay forgotten as I scanned the forest, straining my eyes and ears for any sign of movement. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Show yourself." Only silence answered me. But as I stood there, surrounded by the deepening shadows of twilight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching me, something that didn't belong in these woods, something that shouldn't exist. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The true horror was yet to come, and it would challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world and my place in it. But standing there in that clearing, with night falling fast and unknown eyes upon me, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I turned and ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran, branches whipping against my face and arms. The forest I knew so well suddenly seemed alien and hostile. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, my lungs burning and legs trembling from exertion. As I caught my breath, I fumbled for my radio. "Base camp, this is Williams. Do you copy?" My voice was shaky, and I hoped Marta wouldn't notice. After a moment of static, Marta's voice came through. "I copy, Arthur. Everything okay? You sound off." I hesitated, unsure of what to say. How could I explain what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, without sounding crazy? I found an illegal campsite," I said finally. "Abandoned, but recent. There's something strange about it. I'm heading back now." "Copy that. Be careful out there. It's getting dark." As if on cue, I noticed the lengthening shadows around me. Twilight was settling in, and with it came a whole new set of forest sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures awakening. Normally these sounds were comforting, familiar. Tonight, they sent chills down my spine. I quickened my pace, eager to get back to the ranger station. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. More than once I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see what. I couldn't even put a name to the fear that gripped me. It was fully dark by the time I reached the station. Marta was still there, her face creasing with concern as I burst through the door. "Arthur, what happened out there? You look like you've seen a ghost." I slumped into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not sure, Marta. I found this campsite, way off the usual trails, but it was wrong somehow, and I felt like something was watching me." Marta listened patiently as I recounted the events of the day, the unnatural silence in the forest, the strange campsite, the symbol carved into the tree. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That is odd," she said finally. "But Arthur, you know as well as I do that the forest can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone out there." I nodded, wanting to believe her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than my imagination running wild. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that symbol carved into the tree, felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. When dawn finally broke, I was already up and dressed. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I had to know if what I'd experienced was real or just a product of an overactive imagination. Marta raised an eyebrow when I told her my plan, but she didn't try to stop me. Instead, she insisted on coming along. "Safety in numbers," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. We set out early, retracing my steps from the day before. The forest seemed different in the morning light, less menacing, more familiar. But as we approached the old logging road, that sense of wrongness returned. "There," I said, pointing to the marks I'd seen yesterday. "Do you see those tracks?" Marta knelt to examine them. "Odd," she murmured. "They're not animal tracks, that's for sure. But they're not human either." We followed the tracks down the old road, our pace slowing as we neared the clearing where I'd found the campsite. My hand tightened on my rifle as we pushed through the last of the undergrowth. The clearing was empty. No tent, no fire pit, no symbol carved into any of the trees. It was as if the campsite had never existed. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Marta asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, too stunned to speak. I walked to where the tent had been, searching for any sign of its presence. The ground was undisturbed, covered in a thick layer of pine needles and leaves. "I don't understand," I muttered. "It was right here. I know it was." Marta placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Maybe we should head back, Arthur. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Perhaps—" Her words were cut off by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. We both froze, eyes wide, as the sound faded away. "What was that?" Marta whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It was something. "Run," I said, grabbing Marta's arm. "Run." We tore through the forest, branches scratching our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. The screams continued, always just behind us, getting closer and closer. We burst out onto the main trail, gasping for breath. The screams had stopped, but the forest around us was deathly silent once again. "We need to call this in," Marta said, her voice shaking. "Whatever that was, it's not normal." I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "Agreed, but who's going to believe us?" The next few weeks were a blur of activity. We reported what we'd heard, of course, but without any physical evidence, there wasn't much the authorities could do. They conducted a cursory search of the area but found nothing out of the ordinary. But things had changed in the forest. More hikers reported strange noises, unexplained shadows moving through the trees. And then the disappearances started. It began with a solo hiker who never returned from a day trip. Then a pair of campers vanished without a trace. As summer wore on, more people went missing. Search parties were organized, but they never found anything. No bodies, no equipment, nothing. The forest that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison. Every day I'd patrol the trails, my eyes constantly scanning the trees, my ears straining for any unusual sound. More than once I caught glimpses of something moving just at the edge of my vision, something tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs. But whenever I turned to look, it was gone. Months passed, and the disappearances continued. The authorities were baffled. Theories ranged from animal attacks to a serial killer hiding in the woods. But I knew the truth was something far stranger and more terrifying. As winter approached, I made a difficult decision. I couldn't stay in Clearwater any longer. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the weight of knowing something was out there and being powerless to stop it, it was all too much. I put in for a transfer, citing stress and health concerns. My superiors were understanding. They'd seen the toll the recent events had taken on me. Within a month, I was reassigned to a small park in southern Idaho, far from the dense forests of Clearwater. But even as I drove away from Clearwater for the last time, watching the trees recede in my rearview mirror, I knew that this wasn't over. Whatever was in those woods, whatever had taken those people, it was still out there. And someday, somehow, I knew our paths would cross again. Years passed. I retired from the Park Service and settled into a quiet life in a small town. But I never forgot what happened in Clearwater. I kept track of the news, noting with a grim sort of satisfaction that the disappearances had stopped after I left. But every so often, I'd hear rumors of strange sightings in other forests, of hikers going missing in circumstances that sounded all too familiar. And then, one evening as I sat on my porch watching the sun set, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. Tall and thin, with limbs too long to be human, and a face, if you could call it that, devoid of features. It watched me for a long moment, and I felt the weight of its gaze just as I had all those years ago in Clearwater. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one elongated arm and beckoned to me before melting back into the shadows of the trees. I sit here now, writing this account, knowing that I have a choice to make. Do I ignore what I've seen, try to convince myself that it was a trick of the light or an overactive imagination? Or do I acknowledge the truth I've known deep down all these years, that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the shadows of our forests waiting? As I look out my window at the darkening woods, I know what I have to do. There are truths out there waiting to be uncovered, mysteries that need solving. And if not me, then who? Tomorrow, I'll pack my old ranger gear. I'll lace up my hiking boots, sling my rifle over my shoulder, and step into those woods. Whatever's out there, whatever has been watching and waiting all these years, I'll face it head on. Because some mysteries demand to be solved, no matter the cost, and some calls must be answered, even if they lead us into darkness. This is Arthur Williams, signing off. If you're reading this and I haven't returned, well, you'll know where to start looking. But be careful. Be very, very careful. Because in the depths of the forest, in the spaces between the trees where shadows linger, something is waiting, and it's hungry. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:45 a.m. on that crisp April morning in 2019. At 17, I had grown accustomed to these early starts, but something felt different as I pulled on my worn jeans and flannel shirt. The air held an unusual stillness that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't yet understand. Our ranch sits 45 minutes east of Merritt, surrounded by the rolling grasslands that define this part of the British Columbia interior. During summer months, these fields come alive with grazing cattle, but in April, the landscape maintains an almost otherworldly quiet. The morning air bit at my cheeks as I stepped outside, my breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin atmosphere. Dad was already loading the horses into the trailer, his movements efficient despite the early hour. Rex, our border collie mix, paced nervously around the vehicles, his usual enthusiasm replaced by an odd restlessness that should have served as our first warning. The dog kept looking toward the mountains with his ears pinned back, a behavior I had never witnessed before in all our years of cattle drives. "You ready for this, son?" Dad asked, though his voice carried an undertone I couldn't identify. He had been moving cattle through these mountains for over 20 years, and his experience showed in every deliberate action. Yet something in his demeanor suggested an unease that matched my own growing apprehension. The drive to our starting point took us along Highway 5, past familiar landmarks that looked somehow foreign in the gray pre-dawn light. The mountains loomed ahead of us, their peaks obscured by low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down with an almost physical weight. As we turned off the highway onto the access road, the pavement gave way to gravel, and then to the rough dirt track that would take us up into the higher elevations where the cattle would spend their summer months. I have always found something magical about these early morning hours. The way the first light creeps across the landscape, painting everything in soft pastels before the harsh reality of full daylight takes over. But that morning, the approaching dawn felt ominous rather than beautiful. The shadows seemed darker, more substantial, as if they were hiding secrets that daylight couldn't fully reveal. We reached the cattle gathering point just as the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple. The animals were already restless, their usual docile nature replaced by a skittishness that made them difficult to manage. Several times the entire herd would suddenly shift direction for no apparent reason, as if responding to some signal that Dad and I couldn't perceive. "They're acting strange today," I commented, watching as a dozen heads suddenly bolted toward the fence line before stopping just as abruptly. Dad nodded grimly. "Animals know things we don't," he replied, his eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. "They can sense danger long before we even realize it's there." The words hung in the air like a physical presence as we began the slow process of moving the herd up the mountain. Rex continued his nervous pacing, occasionally letting out small whimpers that seemed to echo strangely in the thin air. Every few minutes he would stop completely and stare into the forest with such focus that I found myself following his gaze, searching for whatever had captured his attention. As we climbed higher, the paved road deteriorated into the rough mountain track I knew so well. But even this familiar route felt alien that morning. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks, were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of leather as Dad shifted in his saddle. The silence pressed against us like a living thing, making every small sound seem amplified and threatening. When a pine cone fell from a tree and hit the ground nearby, both Dad and I jumped as if we had heard gunfire. Rex's ears would perk up at random intervals, responding to sounds that remained beyond our human perception. "How much further to the gate?" I asked, though I knew the answer. The question came from a need to break the oppressive quiet rather than any real uncertainty about our destination. "Another mile, maybe 2, Dad replied, but his voice was tight with a tension that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "We'll push them through to the grazing area and then head back. Should be an easy day." As the words left his mouth, a sound drifted through the trees that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was distant and indistinct, but unmistakably unnatural. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that fell uncomfortably between the two. Rex immediately began growling, his hackles raised as he turned toward the source of the sound. The cattle responded instantly, clustering together in a tight group with their heads raised and nostrils flaring. Several of the older cows began making low, distressed sounds that I had never heard before. The horses grew increasingly difficult to control, fighting the reins and trying to turn back down the mountain. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though the words seemed to carry farther than they should have in the still air. Dad's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "Keep the cattle moving," he said quietly. "Don't look back, don't stop, just keep them moving forward." But as we continued up the mountain track, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Not watching from a distance, but actively tracking our progress through the forest. The sensation of being observed grew stronger with each step, until it became almost unbearable. The forest closed around us like a living trap as we pushed deeper into the mountain wilderness. What had started as a routine cattle drive was transforming into something far more sinister with each passing minute. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows that swallowed the weak morning light and left us moving through a perpetual twilight. Rex's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The dog that usually ran alongside the cattle with boundless energy now stayed close to the horses, his body pressed low to the ground in a submissive posture I had never seen him adopt. Every few yards, he would stop completely and stare into the dense undergrowth to our left, away from the highway. His growls had become more frequent and more urgent, building to a crescendo before suddenly cutting off as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed these growling episodes was what truly unnerved me. In all my years of working in these mountains, I had never experienced such complete absence of natural sound. There should have been dozens of bird species calling from the canopy above us. Squirrels should have been chattering and scampering through the branches. The forest should have been alive with the small sounds of countless creatures going about their daily routines. Instead, there was nothing. Nothing except the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Even our breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of some terrible event. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what's wrong with the forest?" He didn't answer immediately, but I saw his hand move unconsciously to the rifle secured to his saddle. The gesture was subtle, but it sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my system. In all our years of working together, I had never seen him display such obvious concern about our safety in these familiar woods. The cattle were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Animals that normally moved docilely up the mountain were now constantly trying to turn back toward the highway. Several times, the entire herd attempted to bolt as a unit, requiring Rex and both horses to work frantically to keep them moving in the right direction. Their eyes showed white around the edges, and many of them were producing the stressed vocalizations that cattle make when they sense immediate danger. As we climbed higher, the vegetation began to change. The mixed forest of pine and aspen gave way to denser stands of spruce and fir, their branches interlocking overhead to create an almost impenetrable canopy. The path narrowed considerably, forcing the cattle into a single-file line that stretched out behind us like a living chain. This formation made them even more vulnerable and increased their obvious anxiety. "There's the gate," Dad said, pointing ahead to where a wooden structure was barely visible through the trees. But his voice carried no relief, only a grim determination to complete the task at hand. The gate marked the boundary between the lower mountain slopes where we maintained some level of control and the vast wilderness area where the cattle would spend their summer months. Beyond this point, the animals would be largely on their own, free to roam across thousands of acres of mountain meadows and alpine forest. Under normal circumstances, this transition represented the successful completion of our work. But nothing about this morning qualified as normal circumstances. As we approached the gate, Rex suddenly began barking with an intensity that made my heart race, not the playful bark he used during routine cattle work, but a series of sharp, urgent sounds that spoke of genuine alarm. He was staring fixedly at a point approximately 50 yards to our left, where the forest grew particularly dense. The cattle reacted immediately to the dog's distress. The entire herd bunched together in a tight cluster, facing outward like a defensive formation. Several of the bulls began pawing the ground and snorting, their massive heads swinging back and forth as they searched for the source of danger. The horses began prancing nervously, fighting against our attempts to keep them calm. "Easy, Rex," Dad commanded, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "What is it, boy?" The dog continued his frantic barking for another 30 seconds before suddenly falling silent. The abrupt cessation of sound was more frightening than the barking had been. Rex remained in his alert position, muscles tensed and ready to flee, but his vocalizations stopped as if someone had given him a command we couldn't hear. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural settling sounds of the forest. But as I focused my attention, it resolved into something that made my skin crawl with primal fear. It sounded like footsteps, but not quite human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong, the spacing irregular, and there was a quality to the sound that suggested something much larger and heavier than any person. The footsteps seemed to be moving parallel to our route, staying hidden in the dense forest but matching our pace exactly. Sometimes they would fall behind, forcing us to wonder if we had imagined them entirely. Then they would surge ahead, always staying just beyond the range of our vision but close enough to remind us of their presence. "Dad," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "Something's following us." He nodded grimly. "I know. Just keep the cattle moving. We need to get through that gate and get them settled. Then we'll figure out what to do next." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. This was his mountain, his territory, and he had never encountered anything like what we were experiencing. The confidence that came from decades of experience was being replaced by the kind of fear that comes from confronting the unknown. As we reached the gate, I dismounted to open it, my hands shaking as I worked the latch mechanism. The metal was cold against my palms, and I noticed that my fingers left visible moisture marks on the steel surface. My body was producing adrenaline at a rate that left me feeling simultaneously hyper-alert and nauseated. The cattle moved through the gate with obvious reluctance, constantly looking back over their shoulders as if expecting pursuit. Even after we had driven them a considerable distance beyond the boundary, they remained clustered together rather than spreading out to graze as they normally would. "There's the pond," Dad said, pointing to a small body of water that served as a natural resting point during the cattle drive. "We'll let them drink and catch our breath." But as we approached the familiar landmark, I realized that our troubles were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning. The pond sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees, their dark branches creating a cathedral-like space that normally felt peaceful and secure. But as our small convoy of cattle, horses, and humans entered this familiar sanctuary, the oppressive atmosphere that had been building throughout the morning reached a new level of intensity. The cattle immediately spread out around the water's edge, their heads dropping to drink with the desperate urgency of animals who sensed their time might be limited. But even as they satisfied their thirst, they remained alert, ears constantly moving and eyes darting toward the surrounding forest. Several of the older cows positioned themselves between the pond and the tree line, as if trying to shield the younger animals from some perceived threat. Dad and I dismounted near the center of the clearing, ostensibly to rest our horses and enjoy the spectacular view that opened up beyond the pond. From this elevation, we could see across the valley to the Cascade Mountain Range, with its snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sunlight. Closer to us, Stojama Mountain rose from the forest like a green sentinel, its slopes covered in the dense coniferous growth that characterized this region. But the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by the growing sense that we were being observed. The feeling had intensified during our climb to the pond, evolving from a vague unease to a certainty that hostile eyes were tracking our every movement. Rex remained pressed against my legs, his usual enthusiasm for exploring new territory completely absent. "Look at that view," Dad said, but his words sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was normal. "Never gets old, does it?" I nodded, but my attention was focused on the tree line below us. The clearing was positioned on a natural terrace, with the forest floor dropping away sharply on three sides. From our vantage point, we could see down into the canopy for several hundred feet, watching the tops of the trees sway gently in the mountain breeze. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse of movement in the shadows between the trees, roughly 500 feet below our position. My brain initially processed it as a large animal, a bear perhaps, or an elk moving through the underbrush. But as I focused my attention on the spot, what I saw made my mouth go dry with terror. The shape was moving upright, walking on two legs with a gait that was disturbingly human-like, yet fundamentally wrong. It was too tall, too broad through the shoulders, and it moved with a fluid grace that no human could match in such difficult terrain. Even from this distance, I could tell that whatever I was looking at was massive, easily 7 feet tall or more. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Look down there, at about 2 o'clock from that dead snag." He followed my gaze, and I watched his face drain of color as he spotted the same figure that had captured my attention. For several seconds, we both stood frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. The creature, for lack of a better word, continued its methodical progress through the forest, apparently unaware that it was being observed. "Is that a person?" I asked, though my brain was already rejecting that possibility. Dad shook his head slowly. "No person I've ever seen," he replied, his voice tight with concern. "And no person should be in this area anyway. This is private land, posted against trespass." The implications of that statement hit me immediately. Just the week before, Dad and his crew had discovered evidence of illegal activity on the ranch, tire tracks and equipment that suggested people were accessing the land without permission to engage in activities that could damage the grazing areas. The presence of an unauthorized individual in such a remote location raised the possibility that we were dealing with something much more dangerous than wildlife. "I'm going down there to check it out," Dad said, swinging back into his saddle. "You stay here with the cattle and make sure they don't scatter." "Dad, wait," I started to protest, but he was already spurring his horse toward the trail that led down into the forest. I watched him disappear into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing with 30 head of increasingly agitated cattle and a dog that seemed to be on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. The minutes stretched like hours as I waited for Dad's return. The cattle had finished drinking but showed no inclination to spread out and begin grazing. Instead, they remained clustered in a tight group near the center of the clearing, their attention focused on the tree line where Dad had disappeared. Rex had stopped whimpering but remained pressed against my legs, trembling with tension. The silence of the forest was now complete. Not even the whisper of wind through the branches disturbed the oppressive quiet. It was as if the entire mountain ecosystem had shut down, waiting for some terrible event to unfold. The normal sounds of life, insects buzzing, birds calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, had vanished entirely. When Dad finally reappeared, his face was white with shock, and his hands were shaking as he guided his horse back up the slope. The confident rancher who had descended into the forest 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by a man who looked as if he had seen something that challenged his understanding of the natural world. "What did you find?" I called out as he approached, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He dismounted near where I was standing and looked around the clearing, as if seeing it for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. "Son," he said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench, "that isn't a person." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I felt my world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly become unstable. Everything I thought I knew about these familiar mountains was being challenged by an encounter that defied rational explanation. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me was already beginning to understand. Before Dad could answer, a sound echoed through the forest that made both of us freeze in terror. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but quickly escalated into something that sounded like a massive tree falling. The crash seemed to go on forever, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches and disturbed wildlife. But what followed the crash was even more disturbing. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear something moving through the forest with deliberate purpose. Not the random movements of a falling tree settling into place, but the organized sounds of something large and powerful making its way through the dense underbrush. Rex began whimpering again, a sound that cut through me like a knife. The cattle moved even closer together, forming a defensive circle that spoke to instincts developed over thousands of years of evolution. And in that moment, I realized that we were no longer the dominant predators in this environment. We had become prey. The crash that echoed through the forest marked a turning point in our mountain ordeal. What had been an unsettling morning of strange sounds and eerie sensations suddenly transformed into something far more immediate and threatening. The deliberate sounds of movement that followed the crash left no doubt that whatever we were dealing with was actively aware of our presence and was taking steps to respond to it. "We need to leave," Dad said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a command decision. "Right now, get mounted and let's get these cattle moving." I swung back into my saddle with movements that felt clumsy and uncertain. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts to get my reins properly arranged, and I could feel cold sweat running down my back despite the cool mountain air. Rex leaped onto my horse behind the saddle, something he had never done before in all our years of working together. The cattle responded to our urgency with a level of cooperation that was almost supernatural. Animals that had been skittish and difficult to manage throughout the morning suddenly fell into formation as if they understood that their survival depended on following our lead. The entire herd moved as a single organism, flowing across the clearing toward the trail that would take us back toward civilization. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, I made the mistake of looking back toward the forest where Dad had made his disturbing discovery. What I saw made me question my own sanity and left me with images that would haunt my dreams for months to come. A massive pine tree, easily 4 feet in diameter and over 100 feet tall, lay stretched across the forest floor where it had been standing upright just minutes before. The tree appeared to have been pushed over rather than falling naturally, as evidenced by the way its root system had been torn from the earth in a pattern that defied explanation. Fresh earth still clung to the exposed roots, and several smaller trees had been crushed beneath its massive trunk. But what truly terrified me was the movement I could see in the shadows beyond the fallen giant. Dark shapes flitted between the standing trees with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for creatures of such apparent size. They moved in coordinated patterns, as if communicating with each other through some method beyond human understanding. "Don't look back," Dad commanded. but his own voice betrayed the fact that he too was stealing glances over his shoulder. "Just keep moving. We need to get to familiar ground." The trail leading away from the pond was narrow and winding, forcing us to move in single file with the cattle strung out in a long line behind us. This formation made us vulnerable and increased the animals' obvious anxiety. Several times the entire herd tried to break into a run, requiring both horses and Rex to work frantically to maintain control. As we descended through the forest, the oppressive silence that had characterized the morning gave way to a different kind of quiet. This wasn't the absence of natural sound, but rather the hushed expectancy that precedes a storm. Even the rhythm of hooves on the packed earth seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound of our passage. Rex's behavior had become increasingly frantic. The dog that usually ran alongside the cattle was now riding behind my saddle, pressed against my back with his entire body trembling. Every few minutes he would let out a small whimper and look back the way we had come, his ears flattened against his head in an expression of pure terror. "How much further to the gate?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Maybe half a mile," Dad replied, but his voice was tight with uncertainty. "The trail gets rougher from here, and there are several places where we'll be exposed if anything decides to follow us." As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted through the trees that made my blood freeze. It was similar to the noise we had heard earlier in the morning, but much closer and more distinct. The sound seemed to combine elements of different animals, the deep rumble of a large predator, the higher pitch of something in distress, and an underlying quality that was disturbingly human-like. The cattle reacted instantly, bunching together in a panic that threatened to turn into a full stampede. Several of the younger animals broke from the group and tried to run back up the mountain, forcing Dad to spur his horse after them while shouting commands that seemed to have little effect. "Stay with the main herd," he called to me as he disappeared into the trees in pursuit of the fleeing cattle. "Keep them moving toward the gate." Being left alone with the remaining animals in such circumstances was terrifying beyond description. The sounds from the forest were becoming more frequent and seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't operating alone. There were at least two, possibly more, of these creatures coordinating their movements in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond what I had expected. Rex jumped down from behind my saddle and began herding the cattle with a desperation I had never seen in him before. The dog seemed to understand that our lives might depend on keeping the animals together and moving in the right direction. His usual playful approach to cattle work had been replaced by a grim efficiency that spoke to his recognition of the danger we faced. The minutes dragged by like hours as I waited for Dad's return. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide potential threats, and every small sound, a branch creaking in the wind, a pine cone falling to the forest floor, sent fresh waves of adrenaline coursing through my system. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat, and my hands had cramped from gripping the reins too tightly. When Dad finally reappeared with the missing cattle, his face was even paler than before. The confident rancher I had known all my life was being replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been forced to confront the reality that there were things in these mountains that fell outside his considerable experience and expertise. "We need to move faster," he said as he rejoined the main group. "I saw tracks down there that don't match anything I've ever seen before." "What kind of tracks?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Large, bipedal, but not human," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And fresh, very fresh." As we continued down the mountain, I became aware that the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to be pacing us, staying just out of sight but close enough to remind us of their presence. Sometimes the sounds would fall behind, giving us hope that we had outdistanced our pursuers. Then they would surge ahead, always staying just beyond the range of our vision, but close enough to maintain the psychological pressure. The cattle were now in a constant state of near panic, requiring every bit of skill that Dad, Rex, and I possessed to keep them moving in the right direction. Several times, individual animals tried to break away from the group, forcing one of us to pursue them while the others struggled to maintain control of the main herd. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart leap with relief. There, maybe 200 yards ahead, was the gate that marked the boundary between the wilderness area and the more controlled environment of the lower mountain slopes. Beyond that gate lay the familiar territory of our ranch, and the illusion of safety that came with known ground. But as we approached our destination, the sounds from the forest intensified dramatically. What had been occasional noises became a constant chorus of movement and communication that seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously. Whatever was tracking us was closing in for what I could only assume would be some kind of confrontation. "Almost there," Dad said, but his voice carried more hope than confidence. "Just keep them moving." As we pushed the last of the cattle through the gate and secured it behind us, I thought our ordeal might finally be over. But as we would soon discover, our mysterious pursuers were far from finished with us. Chapter 5. Marked Territory. The relief I felt upon reaching the gate and securing it behind us proved to be short-lived. As we began the descent down the mountain path that would eventually lead us back to the ranch, it became increasingly clear that passing through the gate had not ended our encounter with whatever inhabited the deeper wilderness areas. If anything, our mysterious pursuers seemed to have become more active and more aggressive in their behavior. The trail leading down from the gate was one I had traveled countless times over the years. It wound through a mixed forest of aspen and pine, with occasional clearings that provided spectacular views of the valley below. Under normal circumstances, this portion of the journey home was one of my favorites, offering a chance to relax and enjoy the scenery after the hard work of moving cattle to their summer pasture. But nothing about this morning qualified as normal circumstances. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized our climb into the mountains had followed us back down, creating a sense of impending doom that made even familiar landmarks seem foreign and threatening. The cattle remained clustered together in an unnatural formation, their usual tendency to spread out and graze completely suppressed by their obvious fear. Rex had resumed his position running alongside the horses, but his behavior remained far from normal. Every few minutes, he would stop abruptly and stare back up the mountain, his hackles raised and his body tense with anticipation. The dog's distress was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, particularly since his instincts had proven so reliable throughout the morning's events. "Look at that," Dad said suddenly, pulling his horse to a stop and pointing toward a large pine tree that stood beside the trail. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop as I saw what had captured his attention. The tree, which I remembered as unmarked during our passage earlier that morning, now bore a series of deep gashes that ran from roughly 7 feet above the ground down to about 4 feet from the base. The marks appeared fresh, with sap still seeping from the wounds in the bark. But what made these marks truly disturbing was their pattern and depth. They weren't random scratches left by a bear or other large animal. Instead, they formed a deliberate design that looked almost like some kind of primitive communication. 4 parallel lines ran vertically down the trunk, intersected by 2 horizontal lines that created a pattern resembling a crude grid or map. "Those weren't there this morning," I said, though the statement was unnecessary. Both Dad and I had excellent memories for trail conditions, and such obvious markings would never have escaped our notice during the upward journey. Dad dismounted and approached the tree for a closer examination. As he drew near, I could see his face growing increasingly pale as he took in the full extent of the damage. The gouges were deep enough to penetrate several inches into the heartwood, and they had been made with tremendous force. Whatever had created these marks possessed strength far beyond that of any normal forest animal. "Look at the spacing," he said, running his finger along the edge of one of the vertical marks. "These lines are about 6 inches apart, which would suggest fingers or claws of considerable size. But the depth and precision suggest tool use rather than natural weapons." The implications of his observation sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my system. We were dealing with something that possessed not only size and strength, but also intelligence and the ability to manipulate its environment in deliberate ways. The marks on the tree weren't random damage, they were a message. As we remounted and continued down the trail, I found myself scanning every tree we passed for similar markings. The forest that had seemed so familiar just hours earlier now felt like enemy territory, full of potential threats and hidden dangers. Every shadow between the trees could conceal watching eyes, and every sound, no matter how innocent, seemed to carry sinister implications. The cattle sensed our growing anxiety and responded by becoming even more difficult to manage. Several times the entire herd tried to break into a run, forcing Rex to work frantically to keep them together. The animals' eyes showed white around the edges, and many of them were producing stress vocalizations that I had never heard before in all my years of ranch work. "There's another one," I called out, pointing to a second marked tree roughly 50 yards further down the trail. This tree bore a different pattern of marks. 3 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal slash, all carved with the same precision and depth as the first set. The message, whatever it was intended to convey, was being reinforced through repetition and variation. As we continued our descent, we discovered that virtually every large tree along our route had been marked in some way. Some bore the simple grid pattern we had first observed. Others showed more complex designs that seemed to incorporate elements of primitive pictographs. All of the marks appeared fresh, created within the past few hours while we had been moving cattle in the higher elevations. "They're marking territory," Dad said grimly, "letting us know that this area is under their control." The realization that we were traveling through territory that had been claimed by unknown creatures was deeply unsettling. These mountains had been in our family for 3 generations, and Dad had been working cattle through these trails for over 2 decades. The idea that something else considered this area to be their domain challenged our most basic assumptions about the natural order. As we approached a familiar fork in the trail, where one path led back toward the ranch while the other continued up toward the higher peaks, Rex suddenly began barking with an intensity that made my heart race. His attention was focused on the path that led upward, and his body language suggested the presence of immediate danger. Following the dog's gaze, I saw movement in the shadows between the trees roughly 100 yards up the alternate trail. The shapes were indistinct but clearly large, and they were moving with the same coordinated precision we had observed earlier in the morning. Whatever these creatures were, they had positioned themselves to observe our passage and were making no effort to conceal their presence. "They're watching us," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Dad nodded grimly. "They've been watching us all morning. The question is what they plan to do about it." As if in response to his words, a sound echoed through the forest that made both of us freeze in terror. It was similar to the vocalizations we had heard earlier, but much closer and more intense. The sound seemed to combine the hunting call of a large predator with something that was disturbingly human-like in its intonation and phrasing. The cattle reacted immediately, clustering together in a defensive formation that spoke to instincts developed over millions of years of evolution. Several of the bulls began pawing the ground and snorting, their massive heads swinging back and forth as they searched for the source of the threat. But what happened next was even more disturbing than the sound itself. From somewhere up the mountain came an answering call, different in tone but clearly part of the same communication system. Then another, from a different direction entirely. Within seconds, the forest was filled with a chorus of these unnatural vocalizations, creating a symphony of sound that seemed to surround us completely. "There's more than one," Dad said, his voice tight with fear. "There's a whole group of them." The realization that we were outnumbered by creatures of unknown capabilities and intentions was terrifying beyond description. These mountains, that I had considered my home territory, were now revealed to be the domain of something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As the vocalizations faded into silence, we heard a new sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and definitely not human, were approaching through the forest from multiple directions. Whatever these creatures were, they were closing in on our position. "We need to get out of here," Dad said, spurring his horse toward the trail that led back to the ranch. "Right now." But as we began our desperate retreat, I couldn't shake the feeling that running away would only delay the inevitable. Whatever lived in these mountains had marked their territory, and we had trespassed in ways that demanded a response. The chase that followed would test our survival skills to their absolute limits. The decision to flee down the mountain trail seemed like our only option, but as we spurred our horses into a faster pace, it became clear that we were being herded rather than simply pursued. Every time we tried to take a direct route back toward the ranch, sounds would emerge from the forest ahead of us, forcing us to alter our course and take increasingly circuitous paths through terrain that was becoming less and less familiar. The cattle, responding to our obvious panic, had broken into the kind of desperate run that could injure animals and riders alike on such rough terrain. Rex was working frantically to keep the herd together, but even his exceptional skills were being tested by the chaos of our retreat. Several times, individual animals broke away from the group and had to be pursued through dense underbrush that tore at our clothes and scratched our faces. "They're driving us toward the upper trail," Dad shouted over the sound of hooves and heavy breathing. "We can't go back the way we came." The upper trail was a rough path that followed the ridgeline for several miles before descending toward the ranch through a series of switchbacks that were difficult to navigate under the best of circumstances. Taking that route would add hours to our journey and force us to travel through some of the most remote and exposed terrain in the entire area. But as sounds continued to emerge from the forest on both sides of our intended route, it became clear that we had no choice. Whatever was pursuing us had effectively cut off our escape routes and was forcing us to take the path that led deeper into their territory rather than toward the safety of civilization. The upper trail began with a steep climb that left our horses blowing hard within the first few hundred yards. The cattle were struggling even more, their sides heaving as they fought to maintain the pace we were demanding. Several of the older animals were beginning to show signs of exhaustion that could lead to collapse if we didn't slow down soon. "We have to rest them," I called to Dad, though the words felt like an admission of defeat. He nodded grimly and signaled for a halt near a small clearing that offered some visibility in all directions. The cattle immediately spread out and began the heavy breathing that indicated severe stress, while our horses stood with their heads hanging and their flanks covered in sweat. But our rest was interrupted by a sound that made every animal in our group tense with fear. From somewhere behind us came what sounded like a human scream, but distorted in ways that suggested it was being produced by vocal cords that were fundamentally different from our own. The sound rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost musical, but with an underlying quality that spoke to predatory intelligence. Rex began whimpering and pressed himself against my legs, his entire body trembling with terror. The cattle moved closer together, forming the kind of defensive circle that wild animals create when facing pack predators. Even our horses were showing signs of panic, fighting against the reins and trying to bolt in any direction that might lead away from the source of the sound. "What in God's name is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Dad's face had gone white beneath his weathered tan. "I don't know," he replied, "but we can't stay here. We need to keep moving." As we resumed our desperate flight along the ridgeline, the sounds from behind us became more frequent and more varied. What had started as isolated vocalizations was evolving into a complex pattern of communication that seemed to involve multiple participants spread across a wide area. Whatever these creatures were, they were coordinating their movements with a level of sophistication that suggested intelligence far beyond what I had attributed to any wild animal. The trail along the ridge was narrow and exposed, offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains, but also leaving us visible to anything that might be watching from the forested slopes below. Several times I caught glimpses of movement in the trees that suggested we were being paralleled by creatures that could move through difficult terrain with surprising speed and agility. "There," Dad said suddenly, pointing toward a distant hillside where dark shapes were moving with obvious purpose. "Do you see them?" I followed his gaze and felt my mouth go dry as I spotted what appeared to be at least 3 large figures making their way up a slope that would have challenged experienced human climbers. The creatures moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the difficulties of the terrain, covering ground at a rate that suggested exactly where the various creatures were positioned. This psychological warfare was clearly having its intended effect. Both human and animal members of our group were showing signs of panic that threatened to compromise our ability to make rational decisions. "Listen," Dad said suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of wind through the trees, came the distinctive sound of a helicopter. The aircraft was still far away, but it was clearly approaching our general area with the kind of purposeful flight pattern that suggested an official mission rather than casual sightseeing. "Search and rescue?" I asked hopefully. Dad shook his head. "Wrong type of sound. That's military or maybe law enforcement. And it's coming from the direction of the deep wilderness, not from town." As the helicopter sound grew louder, the vocalizations from our pursuers suddenly stopped completely. The abrupt silence was more unnerving than the constant communication had been, suggesting that whatever was tracking us was capable of sophisticated responses to changing circumstances. Within minutes, the aircraft appeared over the horizon, a large, unmarked helicopter painted entirely in white. It was flying low and fast, following the valley floors with the kind of precision that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. As it passed overhead, I could see figures in the cockpit, but the aircraft showed no sign of having noticed our small group on the mountainside. "Where's it going?" I asked, watching as the helicopter disappeared over the next ridge. "Into the deep country," Dad replied. "The areas where nobody goes. The places where—" He paused, as if reluctant to finish the thought. "Where what?" "Where people have been reporting strange encounters for years. The places where experienced outdoorsmen refuse to go alone." As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, our pursuers resumed their vocalizations with renewed intensity. Whatever had caused them to fall silent during the aircraft's passage was no longer a concern, and their communication patterns suggested increased urgency and organization. "We need to get off this ridge," Dad said, spurring his horse toward a trail that led down into a wooded valley. "We're too exposed up here." But as we began our descent into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The creatures that had been pursuing us all morning had demonstrated intelligence and coordination that suggested they were capable of complex planning. Leading us away from open ground and into dense forest where visibility was limited seemed like exactly the kind of tactical decision they might make. As we entered the forest canopy, the oppressive silence returned with renewed intensity. But this time it felt different, not like the absence of sound, but like the calm before a storm. Whatever was going to happen next, I could sense that it was approaching rapidly, and I was terrified to find out what it would be. The autumn of 2019 arrived with an unseasonable warmth that extended well into October, giving me and my friend Garrett extra weeks to enjoy the outdoor activities that would soon be curtailed by winter weather. The events of that terrifying April morning had faded somewhat in my memory, reduced to the kind of half-remembered nightmare that seems less credible in daylight than it had in the moment of experience. Dad and I had never discussed in detail what we had encountered on the mountain that day. The official story was that we had seen evidence of trespassers and had taken the longer route home as a precautionary measure. But I could tell from the way his eyes would sometimes drift toward the mountain peaks during our daily work that the experience had left permanent marks on his psyche that no amount of time would completely erase. Garrett lived at our ranch with his family, occupying one of the smaller houses that accommodated seasonal workers and their dependents. At 15, he was 2 years younger than me, but possessed the kind of fearless enthusiasm for outdoor adventure that made him an ideal companion for exploring the vast wilderness that surrounded our property. The lake that bordered our ranch was a natural wonder that had provided entertainment and recreation for 3 generations of my family. Fed by mountain streams and spring runoff, it maintained a constant level throughout most of the year and supported a healthy population of fish that made it popular with local anglers. The shores were lined with a mixed forest of aspen and pine that provided excellent habitat for deer, elk, and the smaller animals that formed the foundation of the local ecosystem. Garrett and I had spent countless hours that summer building and improving a fort in the swampy woods that bordered the lake's eastern shore. The structure was nothing elaborate, just some salvaged lumber nailed together to create walls and a roof that would keep out most of the weather. But it represented a significant investment of time and effort, and it had become our primary hangout spot during the long summer afternoons. Access to the fort required crossing a small creek that flowed into the lake through a marshy area where the footing was uncertain and the water was often deeper than it appeared. Early in the summer, we had solved this problem by constructing a simple bridge using 4 wooden planks supported by rocks positioned at strategic points in the streambed. The bridge had served us well throughout the summer months, supporting not only our own weight, but also that of the various supplies and materials we had transported to improve our fort. It was sturdy enough that we had never given any thought to its structural integrity or worried about its ability to continue serving our needs. But on that October afternoon when we approached the creek crossing, both Garrett and I stopped in shock at what we found. 2 of the 4 planks that formed our bridge had been snapped cleanly in half, leaving jagged ends that showed the bright, fresh color of recently broken wood. The breaks were not the result of gradual deterioration or normal wear. They showed the characteristics of sudden, violent failure under extreme stress. "What happened to our bridge?" Garrett asked, his voice reflecting the confusion I was feeling. I knelt beside the broken planks and examined them more closely. The wood was dry pine lumber that would normally require considerable force to break, especially given the dimensions of the planks we had used. But these breaks showed none of the splintering and tearing that would result from normal structural failure. Instead, they appeared to have been snapped with a single, powerful application of force applied in exactly the right location to cause maximum damage. Maybe a big animal stepped on it, I suggested, though my own words sounded unconvincing even to me. What kind of animal would be heavy enough to break these boards? Garrett replied. And why would it step on the bridge instead of just wading through the creek? The questions were valid, and they highlighted problems with the innocent explanation I was trying to convince myself to believe. The creek was shallow enough that any large animal could easily ford it without using our bridge, and the placement of the breaks suggested that whatever had caused the damage had deliberately targeted the bridge, rather than accidentally encountering it. But I wasn't ready to confront the alternative explanations that were beginning to form in the back of my mind. The events of the previous spring felt like ancient history, and I had successfully convinced myself that they had been the result of overactive imagination combined with the kind of ordinary wildlife encounters that were common in such remote areas. Probably just got overused, I said, forcing confidence into my voice that I didn't really feel. We'll fix it later. Let's just jump across for now. We made our way across the creek, using the remaining planks and a series of carefully placed hops that left us both slightly wet but safely on the other side. The fort was exactly as we had left it the previous week, 4 walls of mismatched lumber surrounding a small interior space that contained a few pieces of salvaged furniture and some supplies we kept stored there for our various projects. We settled into our usual spots and began the kind of aimless conversation that filled our afternoons: discussions of school, plans for upcoming hunting season, speculation about which girls might be interested in dating, and other topics that seemed incredibly important to teenagers but would seem trivial to adults. The fort provided a sense of privacy and independence that was hard to find elsewhere on the ranch, but our conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of us freeze in sudden terror. It started as a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood with measured, deliberate strokes. The sound was coming from somewhere very close to our fort, possibly from one of the trees that formed the canopy overhead. "What's that?" Garrett whispered, his eyes wide with concern. I held up my hand for silence and focused my attention on the source of the sound. The tapping continued for perhaps 30 seconds, following a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. 3 short taps, followed by 2 longer ones, then 3 short taps again. The rhythm was too regular to be natural, and the sound was too deliberate to be caused by any kind of random environmental factor. As the tapping continued, I felt the same sense of creeping dread that had characterized the morning encounter with Dad several months earlier. This wasn't the kind of innocent mystery that could be explained away with rational thought. This was something that demanded immediate action, preferably involving rapid movement away from our current location. "We need to leave," I said quietly, though I couldn't have explained the source of my certainty. "Right now." Garrett looked confused by my sudden change in mood, but something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Without asking for further explanation, he began gathering up the personal items we had brought to the fort while I moved toward the opening that served as our door. The machinery yard that bordered the swampy woods was perhaps 100 yards from our fort, across an area of mixed forest and marshy ground that offered limited visibility but multiple routes of approach. The main shop building provided a clear view of the tree line, but reaching it would require crossing an open area where we would be exposed to observation from anyone or anything that might be watching from the woods. There was a gap in the barbed wire fence that surrounded the machinery yard, a small opening we had created earlier in the summer to provide easy access between our fort and the more civilized areas of the ranch. Reaching that gap had always been a simple matter of following a well-worn path through the forest, but suddenly the familiar route seemed fraught with danger. I whispered my plan to Garrett as quickly as possible, emphasizing the need for speed and stealth. We would leave the fort simultaneously, move through the forest in a crouched position to minimize our visibility, and make for the fence gap as quickly as possible without creating so much noise that we would attract attention. As we prepared to leave our sanctuary, the tapping sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more frightening than the rhythmic noise had been, suggesting that whatever was making the sound had become aware of our presence and was changing its behavior accordingly. "Go," I whispered, and both of us burst from the fort at a dead run. But as I lifted my head to check our route toward the fence, I saw something that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Standing in a small clearing, perhaps 25 feet directly ahead of us, was a creature that defied every assumption I had made about the natural world. The creature that stood before us in that small clearing was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. At first glance, it appeared almost human, but every detail of its appearance reinforced the terrible reality that this was something fundamentally alien to our world. The face that stared back at us with obvious intelligence was a grotesque parody of human features, as if someone had attempted to create a person from memory, but had gotten all the proportions wrong. Its eyes were the most disturbing feature. Too large for the skull that contained them, positioned too high on the forehead, and spaced too far apart to create the symmetrical arrangement that characterizes human faces. But what made them truly terrifying was their color, a sickly green that seemed to glow with its own internal light, creating the impression that we were being observed by something that belonged more to the realm of nightmares than to the natural world. The nose was pointed and oversized, projecting from the face like the beak of some enormous bird of prey. Below it, the mouth was a slash of darkness from which protruded a single yellowed tooth that curved downward like a fang. The entire facial structure was covered with patches of coarse, dark hair that failed to conceal the gray-green skin beneath. But it was the smell that nearly overwhelmed me, a combination of copper and stale cigarettes that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils and throat with every breath. The odor was so intense and so unnatural that it triggered an immediate gag reflex, making it difficult to focus on the need to escape from our predicament. The creature's body was massive, easily 7 feet tall, and built with the kind of muscular development that suggested enormous physical strength. Its limbs were covered with the same patchy dark fur that marked its face, but in the exposed areas I could see skin that was scarred and wounded in ways that spoke to a life of violence and hardship. For several seconds, we stood frozen in a tableau of mutual observation, two terrified teenagers facing something that challenged their understanding of reality, while the creature studied us with an intelligence that was clearly evaluating our potential as threats or prey. Time seemed suspended as both sides processed the implications of this unexpected encounter. Then the creature took a step forward, and the spell was broken. I turned and ran with a desperation that I had never experienced before, crashing through underbrush and leaping over obstacles with a recklessness that could easily have resulted in serious injury. Behind me I could hear Garrett following, though his panicked screams of "Sasquatch" suggested that his mind was trying to process what we had seen by fitting it into familiar categories. But I knew that what we had encountered was not a Sasquatch or any other creature from folklore or legend. This was something far more disturbing, something that belonged in the space between known and unknown, challenging our most basic assumptions about what was possible in the natural world. The run back to the house seemed to take forever, though it probably covered less than half a mile of familiar ground. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide potential threats, and every sound, no matter how innocent, triggered fresh waves of adrenaline that left me feeling nauseated and shaky. When we finally burst through the front door of the house, both of us were pale and trembling with the kind of shock that comes from confronting something that fundamentally challenges your understanding of reality. Garrett immediately began trying to call his parents, but his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't operate his phone properly. "What did we just see?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, though part of me suspected that I knew exactly what we had encountered. The creature in the clearing bore an unmistakable resemblance to the figures Dad and I had glimpsed on the mountain months earlier. The same impossible height, the same mixture of human and animal characteristics, the same sense of intelligence that was both familiar and utterly alien. As we sat in the living room trying to process what had happened, I became aware of movement outside the house. Through the front windows, I could see across the yard to the grassy hills that rose beyond our property line. As I watched, a massive figure appeared on the skyline, moving with the kind of fluid speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "There," I said, pointing toward the distant hillside. "Do you see it?" Garrett followed my gaze, and his face went white as he spotted the same figure that had captured my attention. Even at a distance of perhaps half a mile, the creature's size was apparent. It moved across the landscape with enormous strides, covering ground at a rate that would have been impossible for any human being. "How can something that big move so fast?" Garrett whispered. I had no answer for his question. Everything about what we were witnessing defied rational explanation and challenged our understanding of what was physically possible. The creature disappeared over the hill within seconds, leaving us with nothing but the memory of its impossible speed and size. That night, both Garrett and I stayed awake in the living room, too frightened to risk sleeping in separate rooms. We played video games and watched television, desperately trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the face of experiences that had shattered our assumptions about the world we lived in. When my parents and brother returned from their evening activities around 9:30, they immediately sensed that something was wrong. But neither Garrett nor I felt capable of explaining what we had encountered. How do you tell responsible adults that you've seen something that shouldn't exist? How do you describe an experience that sounds like the product of overactive imagination or adolescent hysteria? We retreated to my bedroom, where the familiar surroundings provided some illusion of safety and security. But even there, surrounded by the possessions and memories of a normal teenage life, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. At approximately 2 a.m., Garrett shook me awake from the light doze I had finally managed to achieve. His face was white with terror, and his finger was pressed to his lips in a gesture demanding absolute silence. As I became fully alert, I heard what had woken him, a soft, rhythmic tapping on my bedroom window. The sound was identical to what we had heard at the fort earlier that day. Measured, deliberate taps that followed a pattern suggesting intelligence and purpose. But hearing it here, at my bedroom window in the middle of the night, transformed it from mysterious to absolutely terrifying. We sat frozen on my bed, afraid to move or speak or even breathe too loudly. The tapping continued for perhaps 2 minutes, following the same pattern we had heard earlier. 3 short taps, 2 long ones, then 3 short taps again. It was like some kind of code, a form of communication that we couldn't understand but that clearly carried meaning for whatever was producing it. Then the tapping stopped, and we heard the sound of my fence creaking under some tremendous weight. The metal posts and wire that formed our property boundary were designed to contain livestock, not to support the weight of something that could make them groan and complain as if they were being tested to their breaking point. A loud snap echoed through the night air, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Whatever had been putting pressure on our fence had finally exceeded its structural limits and had caused some component of the system to fail catastrophically. We remained frozen on the bed for another hour, listening for any additional sounds that might indicate continued presence of whatever had visited us. But gradually, the normal sounds of night returned. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves, the small movements of nocturnal animals going about their business. When morning finally arrived, I crept outside to assess the damage to our property. The fence showed clear evidence of having been subjected to enormous pressure. Several posts were bent out of alignment, and one section of wire had been snapped completely. My hockey stick, which had been leaning against the fence, was broken in half and lay scattered across the yard. The road hockey ball that had been nearby was completely flattened, as if it had been stepped on by something weighing hundreds of pounds. Across the road, I could see our neighbors loading their daughters into their car with the kind of urgency that suggested they too had experienced something disturbing during the night. The girls appeared to be in a state of hysteria, crying and clinging to their parents in ways that spoke to genuine terror rather than ordinary childhood upset. I wanted to approach them and ask what they had seen, but some instinct warned me that drawing attention to the previous night's events might not be wise. Whatever had visited our property had demonstrated intelligence and purpose that suggested it was capable of much more than simple vandalism or mischief. That incident marked the end of our encounters with the creatures that inhabited the deeper wilderness areas surrounding our ranch. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to something approaching normal routine. But I never again felt completely secure when working or playing in the forested areas of our property. The events of that spring and autumn had revealed the existence of something that challenged every assumption I had made about the natural world. Somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded our ranch, creatures existed that combined human intelligence with physical capabilities that defied explanation. They had demonstrated awareness of our presence, the ability to communicate with each other across considerable distances, and the capacity for behavior that suggested complex planning and coordination. most disturbing of all, they had shown that they were capable of venturing beyond their wilderness territory to investigate and interact with human settlements. The visit to our house in the middle of the night had been a deliberate act of reconnaissance, a gathering of information about our capabilities and vulnerabilities. I have never spoken publicly about these experiences until now, partly because I knew that few people would believe such an account, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to attract the attention of whatever agencies might be interested in such reports. The unmarked helicopter we had seen on the mountain suggested that someone in authority was already aware of the situation and was taking steps to monitor or control it. But as I have grown older and gained perspective on these events, I have come to believe that there are things in our world that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge. The creatures we encountered were not supernatural or mythological. They were flesh and blood entities that had found ways to survive and thrive in environments that most humans never penetrate. They may still be out there, in the deep wilderness areas where few people venture and fewer still return to tell their stories. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees and the shadows are deep and dark, I wonder if they remember us as clearly as we remember them. The thought that we might one day meet again fills me with a terror that time has done nothing to diminish. This happened to me during the spring of 2021, when I was 19 years old and trapped in what felt like an endless cycle of pandemic restrictions. The world had been locked down for over a year, and our small town of Cedar Falls felt more isolated than ever. School had been a mixture of virtual classes and sporadic in-person sessions, but by late May, most of us had completed our coursework early. The administration basically told us that if we had finished our requirements, we didn't need to show up for the remaining weeks. Freedom, in the limited sense that existed during those times, finally felt within reach. My group of friends had been going stir-crazy for months. We'd exhausted every video game, binged every series worth watching, and had grown tired of the endless video calls that had replaced real human interaction. The only activity that remained consistently available to us was fishing. It was outdoors, socially distanced by nature, and gave us something to focus on besides the suffocating atmosphere of constant uncertainty that had dominated our lives. Every morning at exactly 6 a.m., the six of us would meet up. Trevor, who had somehow managed to keep his beat-up Honda Pilot running despite his father's predictions of imminent breakdown, would pick up the rest of us, since we all lived within a few blocks of each other in the Riverside neighborhood. The routine had become sacred to us. Tyler and Jordan from Maple Street, Ben and Drew from Oak Avenue, and myself from the corner house on Pine Road. Our destination was always the same: Miller's Pond, a decent-sized body of water about 15 minutes from town that consistently yielded trout and bass. The fishing wasn't spectacular, but it was reliable, and there was a small bait shop just 2 minutes away where Old Pete would sell us night crawlers and occasionally share stories about the good old days when you could catch fish the size of small dogs from that very pond. The repetition had become comforting. In a world where everything felt uncertain and dangerous, where we couldn't hug our grandparents or eat inside restaurants, this simple routine anchored us. We'd cast our lines, talk about nothing and everything, and for a few hours pretend that the world made sense again. But by early June, even our beloved routine had started to feel stale. We'd mapped every inch of Miller's Pond, knew exactly where the base liked to hide during different times of day, and could predict with frightening accuracy which spots would be productive. Tyler had started bringing a book instead of focusing on fishing. Jordan spent more time skipping rocks than casting his line. We all felt it, the need for something new, something different. That's when Trevor mentioned the app. Fishbrain had been downloaded on Trevor's phone for months, but he'd never really explored its full potential. It was designed to be a social network for anglers, where people could log their catches, share photos, and most importantly for us, mark productive fishing spots with detailed information about what species were being caught and when. On our final official day of school, while we sat around Miller's Pond, catching nothing but the same small bluegill we'd been pulling out for weeks, Trevor started scrolling through the app's map feature. His eyes lit up as he zoomed in on areas within a reasonable driving distance. "Look at this," he said, turning his phone screen toward us. There's a creek system about 30 minutes north that people are saying is incredible for trout, rainbow, brook, and apparently some brown trout too. The location markers showed consistent catches over the past several weeks. Photos of beautiful rainbow trout with vivid pink stripes, brook trout with their distinctive speckled patterns, and even a few impressive brown trout that looked like they belonged in a fishing magazine rather than a small creek in our area. Says here the access is a bit of a hike, Trevor continued, reading the details. About 4 miles of trail to reach the best spots, but look at these fish. He scrolled through photo after photo. These weren't the small, somewhat disappointing fish we'd been catching at Miller's Pond. These were the kind of trout that made fishing feel like an adventure rather than just a way to pass time. Ben leaned over to get a better look. 4 miles isn't that bad. We've hiked further than that before. Yeah, but look at what some of these people are saying about the terrain, Drew pointed out, reading over Trevor's shoulder. Multiple elevation changes, some steep sections, and apparently you need to cross the creek several times to access different pools. That actually made it sound more appealing to me. I'd been fly fishing for 3 years, ever since my uncle had taught me during a trip to Colorado, and I was getting tired of casting into the same predictable spots. The idea of technical fishing in varied terrain where different techniques might be required for different sections of the creek sounded exactly like what we needed. The app shows that the best fishing is early morning, Tyler observed. So we'd need to start even earlier to account for the drive and hike. We spent the next hour planning. The logistics were more complex than our usual routine, but not impossibly so. Trevor would pick everyone up at 5:30 a.m. instead of 6:02. We'd need to pack more supplies since we'd be hiking for several hours and wouldn't have the convenience of Pete's bait shop nearby. Most importantly, we'd need to let our parents know we'd be going to a new location and would likely be out of cell phone range for most of the day. The more we talked about it, the more excited we became. This felt like the first real adventure we'd had in over a year. Everything else in our lives had become so controlled, so limited, so predictable. The idea of exploring somewhere new, somewhere that might actually challenge us, felt like stepping back into a version of ourselves we'd almost forgotten existed. Let's do it tomorrow, I suggested. It's supposed to be clear and cool in the morning, perfect fishing weather. Everyone agreed immediately. We spent the rest of the afternoon gathering information about the location, studying the trail maps available online, and planning what gear to bring. I decided I'd pack both my fly rod for the shallow areas where I could work on my technique and my spinning rod for the deeper pools where the bigger fish would likely be waiting. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. Not because I was worried, but because I was genuinely excited for the first time in months. I kept thinking about the photos we'd seen on the app, imagining myself working my way up that creek, reading the water, adapting my technique to new challenges. I had no idea that within 24 hours, fishing would be the furthest thing from my mind. Trevor's Honda Pilot rumbled to life at 5:25 a.m., cutting through the pre-dawn silence of our neighborhood. The early June air was crisp and carried the scent of dew-covered grass and the faint aroma of someone's coffee brewing somewhere nearby. I had packed my gear the night before: fly rod, spinning rod, tackle box organized with various flies and lures, a day pack with water and snacks, and my camera to document what I hoped would be our best fishing trip yet. The others emerged from their houses like zombies, still half asleep but carrying their gear with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this routine dozens of times before. Tyler clutched a large coffee mug and moved with the deliberate slowness of someone not quite ready to be awake. Jordan had his lucky fishing hat pulled low over his eyes and carried what looked like enough tackle to stock a small sporting goods store. "Everyone ready for an adventure?" Trevor asked, with the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to convince himself he was fully awake. A chorus of mumbled agreement came from the group as we loaded our gear into the back of the Pilot. The drive would take us northwest, away from town and into areas I'd rarely explored. According to the GPS, our destination was a trailhead parking area that served multiple hiking trails, including the one that would take us to the creek system we'd studied on Fishbrain. As we drove, the familiar landscape of our town gradually gave way to more rural areas. Subdivisions became farmland, strip malls became scattered houses with large yards, and streetlights became increasingly rare. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rolling hills and creating a golden glow that made everything look more beautiful than it had any right to. According to the app, the best fishing is in the first 2 hours after sunrise, Ben said, scrolling through his phone, so timing should be perfect. What's the plan when we get there? Drew asked. Are we sticking together or splitting up like usual? That was a good question. At Miller's Pond, we'd developed a system where we'd break into 2 groups of 3, cover different areas, and meet back up around noon to compare our catches and share stories. The new location was larger and more complex, with multiple pools and runs spread out over several miles of creek. I think we should stick together for the first part, I suggested. At least until we get a feel for the area and figure out where the fish are. After that, maybe we split up into smaller groups but stay within shouting distance. The GPS announced that we'd arrived at our destination just as we spotted a small gravel parking area on the left side of the road. It was more primitive than I'd expected, just a cleared area with space for maybe 8 or 10 cars, a wooden sign marking the trailhead, and a small information board with a basic map of the trail system. We were the only vehicle there. Guess we're the early birds today, Tyler observed as we unloaded our gear. The trailhead sign indicated that our destination, marked as Whispering Creek Access, was 3.8 miles via the Blue Blaze Trail. The estimated hiking time was listed as 2 to 3 hours, depending on fitness level and weather conditions. A warning at the bottom of the sign mentioned that the trail crossed the creek multiple times and could be slippery when wet. Creek crossings, Jordan said, adjusting his backpack straps. Good thing I brought the waterproof boots. We set off just as the sun cleared the horizon, following blue blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained dirt path that wound gently upward through mixed hardwood forest. The morning air was filled with bird songs I couldn't identify, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of running water. After about 20 minutes of hiking, we encountered our first creek crossing. The water was shallow but moving fast, flowing over smooth rocks that looked treacherous. A fallen log served as a makeshift bridge, but it was narrow and didn't look particularly stable. I'm not trusting that log with my gear, Ben said, eyeing the crossing skeptically. Rock hopping it is, Trevor decided, pointing to a series of larger stones that provided a more stable path across the water. We made it across without incident, though Tyler managed to get one boot wet when a rock shifted under his weight. The trail continued on the other side, climbing more steeply now and leading us deeper into the forest. The second crossing came after another 30 minutes of hiking. This time the creek was wider and deeper, and there was no convenient log. The trail simply disappeared into the water on one side and picked up again on the opposite bank. This is where the real fishing starts, I said, studying the pool that had formed just upstream from the crossing. The water was crystal clear, and I could see what looked like the shadows of fish holding in the deeper sections. We crossed more carefully this time, taking our time to ensure our gear stayed dry. The water was shockingly cold even through my boots, and the current was stronger than it had appeared from the bank. By the time we reached what the trail map indicated was the main fishing area, we'd been hiking for just over an hour. The forest had grown denser around us, and the sound of the creek had become a constant background presence. We were now following the water more closely, with the trail sometimes running right alongside the bank and sometimes cutting inland to avoid particularly rough terrain. This is it, Trevor announced, consulting his phone and the FishBrain app. According to the GPS, we're right in the middle of the area where people have been catching those big trout. The creek in front of us looked like something from a fishing magazine. Clear water flowed over a series of granite shelves, creating multiple pools of varying depths. Overhanging trees provided cover and dropped insects into the water, while submerged logs and boulders created the kind of structure that trout love to hide behind. This is incredible, Jordan said, already starting to assemble his rod. I can see why people hike all the way up here. We found a flat area near the bank where we could spread out our gear and get organized. The plan was to start fishing here and work our way upstream, hitting different pools and runs as we went. We'd stay in visual contact with each other, but spread out enough that we wouldn't interfere with each other's fishing. I was in the process of rigging my fly rod when Tyler suddenly stopped what he was doing and tilted his head to one side. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of confusion. We all stopped and listened. At first, all I could hear was the sound of water flowing over rocks and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then, faintly, from somewhere upstream, came the sound of something moving through the undergrowth. "Probably just a deer," Ben said, but he didn't sound entirely convinced. The sound came again, closer this time. Not the delicate stepping of a deer, but something heavier, more deliberate. Something that seemed to be moving parallel to the creek, staying just out of sight in the dense forest. "Maybe we should have picked a busier trail," Drew muttered, glancing around nervously. But the sound faded away, and after a few minutes of listening to nothing but natural forest noises, we convinced ourselves it really had been just a deer or some other harmless wildlife. We were in their territory after all, and it made sense that our presence might have disturbed some of the local animals. I went back to rigging my fly rod, selecting a small dry fly that might tempt any trout feeding on the surface. The morning was shaping up to be perfect for fishing. Overcast enough to keep the fish active, but with enough light to see what we were doing. I had no way of knowing that something in the woods was watching us, learning our voices, and waiting for the right moment to use what it had learned. The fishing started off exactly as we'd hoped. Tyler, working a deep pool about 50 yards downstream from our starting point, landed a beautiful rainbow trout within the first 15 minutes. Jordan had connected with something substantial in a run beneath an overhanging tree, though he lost it when his line got tangled in the branches. Ben and Drew had moved upstream and were methodically working their way through a series of smaller pools, while Trevor stayed near our gear and focused on a promising eddy where the current created a perfect feeding lane. I had waded out into the creek itself, working my fly rod in the shallow areas where I could see trout rising to take insects off the surface. The water was so clear that I could watch the fish react to my fly, adjusting my technique based on their behavior. It was technical, engaging fishing that required complete focus, exactly what I'd been craving after months of predictable fishing at Miller's Pond. For the first hour, everything was perfect. The creek lived up to every positive review we'd read on FishBrain. The fish were active, the scenery was spectacular, and the challenge of reading new water and adapting our techniques kept all of us engaged and excited. Then the sound started. It began as something subtle. Just the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves from somewhere in the forest around us. At first, none of us paid much attention. We were in the middle of wilderness area, after all, and the presence of wildlife was not only expected but part of the appeal. Deer, squirrels, birds, maybe even black bears, all of these were common in the region, and the sounds we were hearing seemed consistent with normal animal activity. But as the morning progressed, the disturbances became more frequent and seemed to follow a pattern that was increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidental. I was in the middle of working a particularly promising pool when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the forest behind me. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of smaller animals, but the deliberate, measured pace of something large moving through the undergrowth. I paused my casting and turned to look, but the forest was too dense to see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction. "Hey, Tyler," I called out. "You moving around up there?" "No, I'm still in the same spot," he replied from downstream. "Why?" "Just thought I heard someone walking around behind us. Probably just a deer. They're everywhere up here." That explanation satisfied me for the moment, and I went back to fishing. But over the next 30 minutes, the sounds continued and began to take on characteristics that were harder to explain away as normal wildlife activity. The footsteps seemed to move in parallel with us as we worked our way upstream. When we stopped, they stopped. When we moved to a new location, they resumed. It was as if something was following our progress along the creek, staying just out of sight but maintaining a constant distance. "Are you guys hearing this too?" Jordan asked during a brief break in the fishing action. He was looking nervously at the tree line, his rod forgotten in his hands. "The footsteps?" Ben replied. "Yeah, I've been hearing them for the last 20 minutes. It's weird how they seem to match our movement." "Animals do that sometimes," Drew said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They're curious about humans. Maybe it's just trying to figure out what we are." But even as he said it, we all knew that the explanation didn't quite fit what we were experiencing. The sounds were too consistent, too deliberate, too clearly focused on our location. Wild animals might be curious about human presence, but they typically either approached for a closer look or moved away to avoid contact. They didn't typically maintain a steady parallel course for extended periods. Trevor, who had been quiet during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "There's something else. I've been watching for game trails and other signs of animal activity, and I'm not seeing much. No deer tracks, no scat, no browsing damage on the vegetation. For an area that's supposed to have a lot of wildlife, it's surprisingly empty." That observation sent a new chill through the group. Trevor had grown up hunting with his father and knew how to read the signs of animal presence in the forest. If he was saying that the normal indicators of wildlife weren't there, it meant that either the animals had learned to avoid this area for some reason, or something had caused them to relocate. "Maybe we're overthinking this," I suggested, though I didn't really believe it myself. "Let's just stick together a little closer and keep fishing. We came here to catch trout, and the fishing has been amazing." We tried to return to our normal routine, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before we had been relaxed and focused on the technical aspects of fishing, now we found ourselves constantly glancing over our shoulders and listening for sounds that might not belong. The jokes and casual conversation that usually accompanied our fishing trips had been replaced by a tense awareness of our surroundings. The sounds in the forest continued, sometimes fading away for 10 or 15 minutes at a time before resuming with renewed intensity. It was during one of these quiet periods that we heard something that made all of us stop what we were doing and look at each other with genuine alarm. From somewhere upstream, maybe 200 yards away, came the unmistakable sound of a human voice. It was faint and indistinct, more like the cadence and rhythm of human speech than actual words we could understand. But there was no mistaking it for any kind of natural sound. Someone else was in the forest with us, and they were close enough that we could hear them talking. "Did you guys hear that?" Ben asked unnecessarily. We had all heard it. "Should we go check it out?" Tyler suggested. "Maybe it's other hikers who got lost or need help." But even as he said it, something about the voice didn't seem right. It was too regular, too repetitive, like someone reciting the same words over and over again. And there was only one voice, no conversation, no indication of multiple people, just that single, steady stream of incomprehensible speech. "Let's give it a few minutes," I decided. "If there are other hikers, they'll either move on or come this way eventually. If they need help, they'll call out more clearly." We waited, listening intently, but the voice faded away without coming any closer. For the next half hour, the forest around us was quieter than it had been all morning. Even the normal birdsong seemed muted, as if the entire ecosystem was holding back and waiting for something to happen. It was during this period of unnatural quiet that the real horror began. The voice, when it came back, was different. Instead of the indistinct murmuring we'd heard earlier, this time the words were clear, recognizable, and absolutely terrifying. "Guys, come here." It was Ben's voice, perfect in every detail. The same tone, the same inflection, even the same slight accent that came from growing up in our small town. But Ben was standing right next to me, his face gone pale as he heard his own voice calling to us from somewhere deep in the forest. We all froze. Tyler's rod slipped from his hands and clattered against the rocks. Jordan took an involuntary step backward, nearly losing his footing on the slippery creek bottom. Drew grabbed onto Trevor's arm, as if to confirm that what we were hearing was really happening. "That wasn't me," Ben whispered, though his statement was completely unnecessary. We could all see him standing there, mouth slightly open in shock, staring in the direction the voice had come from. "Guys, come here," the voice repeated, identical to the first time. Same words, same intonation, like a recording being played back. "What the hell is that?" Tyler managed to ask, his voice barely audible. None of us had an answer. The logical part of my brain was scrambling for explanations. Cell phone audio, some kind of electronic device, maybe even other hikers playing a cruel prank. But the voice had been too perfect, too exact. It wasn't just someone doing an impression of Ben's voice. It was Ben's voice, captured and repeated with impossible precision. "We need to get out of here," Drew said, already starting to pack up his gear with shaky hands. But before any of us could respond, the voice came again. This time it was Trevor's voice, calling from a completely different direction. Lincoln heard himself too. The words made no sense. There was no Lincoln in our group. But the voice was unmistakably Trevor's. Same vocal patterns. same slight rasp that came from years of seasonal allergies. Trevor himself was standing 3 feet away from me, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. "How is this possible?" he asked, but his question was answered immediately by the sound of his own voice echoing back from the forest. "How is this possible?" That's when I realized what was happening, and the understanding hit me like a physical blow. Something in the forest was listening to us, learning our voices, and playing them back, not just mimicking the sound, but capturing and reproducing our exact speech patterns with perfect accuracy. "Everyone shut up," I hissed. "Don't say anything else." We stood in complete silence for several minutes, barely breathing, listening to the forest around us. The normal sounds of running water and rustling leaves seemed amplified in the absence of human speech. But underneath those natural sounds, I could swear I heard something else. A subtle scratching or scraping, like something moving through the undergrowth while trying to remain quiet. Then Jordan's voice came from upstream. "We need to get out of here." The exact words Drew had spoken moments before, but in Jordan's voice. Perfect reproduction, perfect timing. Like something had been waiting for the right moment to demonstrate that it had been listening to everything we said. That broke our resolve to remain silent. Drew started shoving gear into his backpack with frantic energy. Tyler began breaking down his rod with hands that shook so badly he could barely manage the simple task. Ben kept looking around the forest, as if he expected to see something emerge from the trees at any moment. "We're leaving," Trevor announced in a voice that was trying to sound authoritative but came out high and strained. "Right now, everyone pack up everything and we're going back to the car." But as soon as he said it, we heard the words repeated from multiple directions around us. "We're leaving, right now. Everyone pack up everything and we're going back to the car." First in Trevor's voice from upstream, then in Ben's voice from across the creek, then in my own voice from somewhere behind us. The same words spoken in perfect reproduction of our own speech patterns, coming from locations that would be impossible for any normal person to reach in the time that had elapsed. The forest around us had become an echo chamber of our own voices, all speaking words we had actually said, but coming from directions where none of us were standing. "Move," I said, shouldering my pack and starting toward the trail. "Don't talk, just move." We half ran, half stumbled back toward the first creek crossing, abandoning any pretense of normal hiking pace. Behind us, our own voices continued to echo through the forest. "Move. Don't talk. Just move." What the hell is that? We need to get out of here. How is this possible? The voices followed us as we made our way along the trail, always staying just out of sight but maintaining a constant presence. Sometimes multiple voices would speak at once, creating a surreal chorus of our own words spoken back to us from the darkness between the trees. At the first creek crossing, Tyler slipped on the wet rocks and went down hard, soaking himself up to the waist in the frigid water. Normally, this would have been the source of jokes and laughter from the rest of us. Instead, we hauled him up and kept moving, driven by a terror that none of us completely understood, but all of us felt with absolute certainty. "Tyler's hurt," came Jordan's voice from somewhere behind us. "We should help him." But Jordan was right next to me, and Tyler was already back on his feet and moving. The voice was trying to get us to stop, to turn around, to go back toward whatever was speaking with our voices. We kept moving. The trail back seemed longer than it had during our morning hike, every turn revealing more forest that stretched endlessly ahead of us. Our pace had settled into a fast walk rather than the panicked run we'd started with, but the tension in the group was increasing rather than decreasing as we put distance between ourselves and the creek. The voices had stopped following us after we crossed the second creek, but somehow their absence was more disturbing than their presence had been. At least when we could hear them, we knew where the threat was located. Now we were hiking through forest that felt completely hostile, knowing that something was out there but having no way to track its location or intentions. Tyler's fall into the creek had left him soaked and shivering, despite the relatively warm morning temperature. His teeth were chattering, and he kept stumbling on sections of trail that should have been easy to navigate. The combination of cold and adrenaline was taking a toll on his coordination and judgment. "We need to stop and get Tyler warmed up," Drew said during a brief pause to check our location on the trail map. "No," Tyler replied immediately. "I'm fine. Let's just get back to the car." But even as he said it, his voice came echoing back from the forest around us. "I'm fine. Let's just get back to the car." Not Tyler's current voice, strained and shaky from cold and fear, but his normal voice from earlier in the morning when he had been relaxed and confident. The thing in the forest was still with us, still listening, still learning. "It followed us," Ben said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. Those words, too, were immediately echoed back from multiple directions. It followed us. We resumed hiking with renewed urgency, but now the forest itself seemed to be working against us. Branches that I didn't remember from the morning hike caught at our backpacks and fishing rods. Rocks that had been stable on our way in now shifted underfoot, threatening to send us tumbling. The trail itself seemed less clear, with blue blazes that appeared to be missing or faded in crucial locations. "Are we on the right trail?" Jordan asked, consulting his phone and finding no GPS signal. "Are we on the right trail?" came the immediate response from somewhere ahead of us. But this time the voice wasn't quite right. It was Jordan's voice, but there was something mechanical about it, as if it were being played through a speaker rather than spoken by a human throat. The mimicry was becoming less perfect, more obviously artificial. "It's getting worse at copying us," I observed. "It's getting worse at copying us," came the reply, but this time in multiple voices simultaneously, a horrifying chorus of our own speech patterns layered on top of each other until they became almost unintelligible. That's when I realized what was happening. The thing in the forest wasn't just learning our voices. It was learning how to use them. What had started as simple repetition was evolving into something more complex and more threatening. It was beginning to experiment with combinations of our words, trying to create new sentences from the vocabulary it had collected. "Don't say anything else," I warned the group. "It's learning from everything we say." But the warning came too late. Our voices began speaking from the forest around us in combinations we had never used. "Tyler's hurt. How is this possible? We need to get out. Are we on the right trail? Everyone pack up. Don't say anything else." The sentences were grammatically correct but contextually wrong, like someone learning a language from a textbook but not understanding how the words were actually supposed to fit together. The effect was deeply unsettling, creating a sense that something alien was attempting to understand human communication and failing in ways that revealed its fundamental otherness. We reached the halfway point of our return hike, a small clearing where the trail split to accommodate hikers heading to different destinations, and paused to regroup. Tyler was in bad shape, his lips slightly blue, and his coordination noticeably impaired. Drew was checking his phone obsessively, hoping for cell signal that never appeared. Ben and Jordan kept looking back the way we had come, as if expecting to see something pursuing us through the trees. "How much further?" Trevor asked, consulting the trail map. The question was answered not by any of us, but by a voice from the forest that sounded like a combination of all our voices speaking at once. "How much further to the car where Tyler needs help because it followed us?" The sentence structure was wrong, the word choice was wrong, but the meaning was clear enough to send a new wave of terror through our group. Whatever was speaking had been listening to everything we'd said throughout the morning and was now trying to create new communications from the pieces it had collected. More disturbing was the implication that it knew our destination. It had somehow determined that we were heading to a car, and it seemed to understand that Tyler was in distress. This wasn't just mimicry. It was analysis and comprehension. 2 miles, I said, reading the trail marker and immediately regretting giving it new words to work with. 2 miles to help Tyler get warm where the car is waiting for us, came the response from multiple directions, the voice shifting between different members of our group mid-sentence. We started moving again, but now every step felt like we were walking deeper into a trap. The thing in the forest wasn't just following us. It was hurting us, learning our patterns, and possibly preparing for something we couldn't anticipate. The trail began to descend more steeply as we approached the final section before the parking area. This should have been encouraging. We were getting close to our destination and to the safety of civilization. Instead, it felt like we were walking into the lowest point of a funnel, with whatever was hunting us positioned above and around us. "I can see the parking area," Trevor announced as we rounded a bend that opened up into a view of the gravel lot where we'd left the Honda Pilot. "I can see the parking area where we left the car this morning before hiking to catch trout in the creek," came the immediate response, but this time the voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the parking lot itself. It was waiting for us at our destination. The Honda Pilot sat exactly where we had left it, appearing completely normal in the late morning sunlight. The gravel parking area was still empty except for our vehicle, and everything looked precisely as it had when we'd arrived, full of excitement and anticipation just a few hours earlier. But now the sight of our car filled me with dread rather than relief. If the voice was coming from the direction of the parking lot, then whatever was mimicking us had either moved ahead of our position or had never been behind us at all. The implications of either possibility were terrifying. "It could be between us and the car," Drew said, voicing what we were all thinking. "It could be between us and the car," echoed our own voices from the forest around the parking area. We stopped at the edge of the tree line, 50 yards from the vehicle, trying to assess the situation. The parking area was open ground with no cover. If we made a run for the car, we'd be completely exposed for the entire distance. But staying in the forest meant remaining in the territory of whatever was hunting us. "Keys," Trevor said, patting his pockets. "Where are my keys?" He went through every pocket twice, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as he failed to locate the car keys. Without them, we were trapped regardless of what might be waiting between us and the vehicle. "Keys," came the echo from the forest, but this time followed by, "Where are my keys this morning before hiking to the creek?" "Check your backpack," Ben suggested. Trevor dumped the contents of his backpack onto the ground, scattering gear and supplies while searching for the keys. Wallet, phone, granola bars, first aid kit, but no keys. His face was pale and his hands were shaking as he went through everything a second time. "They're not here," he said. "I know I had them when we got out of the car." "They're not here when we got out of the car," the voices repeated from multiple locations around the parking area. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were footprints in the gravel near the Honda Pilot, fresh footprints that hadn't been there when we'd parked. Someone had been at our car while we were hiking. "Look at the ground around the car," I said, pointing toward the vehicle. The others saw it too, clear impressions in the gravel showing that someone had walked around the entire vehicle, examining it from every angle. The footprints were too large to belong to any of us, and the tread pattern didn't match any of our hiking boots. "Someone's been here," Jordan said. "Someone's been here examining the car while we were hiking," came the response from somewhere near the vehicle itself. We were trapped. Our transportation was 50 yards away, but someone or something had already discovered it and was potentially waiting for us to approach. The keys were missing, which meant that even if we reached the car safely, we might not be able to leave. "We need to think about this," I said. "Maybe we should head back to the trail and try to find other hikers who can help us." But even as I suggested it, I realized how foolish the idea was. We hadn't seen any other people all morning, and the trail system was remote enough that we might not encounter anyone for hours or even days. Tyler was getting worse. His shivering had become more violent, and he was having trouble following our conversation. "Tyler needs medical attention," Ben said. "We can't wait around here indefinitely." "We can't wait around here for Tyler who needs medical attention," the voices responded. But this time, there was something different about them. They were clearer, more focused, as if whatever was speaking was getting better at combining our words into coherent statements. Trevor made the decision for all of us. "We're going for the car, all together, fast as we can. If someone's waiting there, at least we'll all be together to deal with it." He started toward the parking area before any of us could object, moving at a fast walk that quickly accelerated into a run. The rest of us followed, abandoning any attempt at stealth or caution. If something was going to happen, it was going to happen now. The 50 yards to the car felt like 500. Every step across the open gravel seemed to take forever, and I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us or see something emerge from the tree line. But we reached the Honda Pilot without incident, gathering around the driver's door while Trevor searched his pockets one more time for keys that weren't there. "Check inside the car," Drew suggested. "Maybe you left them in the ignition." Trevor cupped his hands against the driver's side window and peered inside. His expression changed from desperation to confusion to something approaching relief. "They're there," he said. "The keys are in the ignition." "That's impossible," Jordan said. "You locked the car when we got out." But Trevor was already trying the door handle, and it opened easily. The car was unlocked, the keys were in the ignition, and everything appeared normal except for the fact that none of us remembered leaving it that way. "Get in," I said. "We'll figure it out later." We threw our gear into the back and piled into the vehicle, Tyler claiming the front passenger seat where he could get the most benefit from the heater. Trevor turned the key and the engine started immediately. As we pulled out of the parking area and onto the road that would take us back to civilization, our own voices called after us from the forest. "Get in the car where the keys are waiting for Tyler who needs help. We'll figure it out later when we get back to town. Check inside the car that's unlocked this morning." The sentences were becoming more sophisticated, more contextually appropriate. Whatever was in that forest was learning fast, and the thought of what it might be capable of by the time other hikers encountered it made me sick to my stomach. We drove in complete silence for the first 20 minutes, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what had just happened. Tyler gradually stopped shivering as the car's heater warmed him up, but his face remained pale, and he kept glancing nervously at the mirrors as if expecting to see something following us. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that anyone spoke. "We need to report this," Ben said. "Other people hike that trail. They need to know there's something dangerous up there." "Report what exactly?" Drew asked. "That we heard voices in the forest? That something was copying the way we talk? Who's going to believe that?" It was a fair question. The story sounded insane even to us, and we had lived through it. Law enforcement would likely assume we had been pranked by other hikers, or that we had misinterpreted natural sounds due to paranoia and isolation. "What about the footprints around the car?" Jordan suggested. "And the missing keys that somehow ended up in the ignition? Those were concrete, physical evidence that something unusual had occurred. But they could also be explained by human activity. Someone could have found Trevor's dropped keys and put them in the car as a good deed, or the footprints could have belonged to maintenance workers or other legitimate visitors to the area." "I'm calling the ranger station," Trevor decided, pulling out his phone now that we had cell service again. At minimum, they should know that people are having unusual experiences on that trail. He made the call, speaking to someone at the local Forest Service office and providing a carefully edited version of our experience. He mentioned hearing voices that seemed to be following us, finding evidence that someone had been at our vehicle, and feeling unsafe enough to cut our trip short. He avoided mentioning the voice mimicry, which was the most unbelievable part of our story. The ranger he spoke with was polite and professional, taking down our information and promising to have someone check the trail within the next few days. She mentioned that they occasionally received reports of unusual activity in remote areas, usually involving people who were under stress or inexperienced in wilderness settings. "She thinks we're city kids who got spooked by normal forest sounds," Trevor reported after ending the call. But I knew what we had experienced wasn't normal, and as the days passed, my certainty about that only increased. I found myself researching similar incidents online, looking for other reports of voice mimicry in wilderness areas. What I found was disturbing. There were scattered accounts going back decades of hikers and campers reporting voices that seemed to copy human speech patterns. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misunderstandings, but the consistency of the details across different times and locations was striking. People described the same progression we had experienced. First hearing indistinct voices, then perfect mimicry of their own speech, then increasingly sophisticated attempts to combine their words into new sentences. The most disturbing reports came from areas where search and rescue teams had been called to look for missing hikers. In several cases, other hikers had reported hearing the voices of the missing people, calling for help from locations where no one was found. The missing hikers were sometimes located days later in completely different areas, with no memory of how they had gotten there. I shared my research with the others during a group video call a week after our experience. None of us had been sleeping well, and we all admitted to feeling anxious and unsettled in ways that we couldn't fully explain. "So what do you think it was?" Tyler asked. He had recovered physically from his exposure to the cold creek water, but like the rest of us, he was struggling with the psychological impact of what we had encountered. "I think it was human," I said. "Someone with technology that could record and play back our voices with perfect accuracy. Someone who has been using that trail to target hikers." It was the most rational explanation I could come up with, though it didn't fully account for everything we had experienced. The speed with which our voices had been recorded and played back, the ability to combine our words into new sentences, the apparent coordination of sounds from multiple locations. All of these suggested technology more sophisticated than anything I knew to be available to civilians. But why? Ben asked. What would be the point? Maybe to separate people from groups, Drew suggested. If you can mimic someone's voice and make it sound like they're calling for help from a different location, you could potentially lure their friends away from safety. The implication was horrifying. If someone was using advanced voice mimicry technology to hunt hikers in remote areas, then other people were in immediate danger. Our escape might have been successful, but the next group to encounter this threat might not be so fortunate. We need to do more than just report it to the Forest Service, I said. We need to make sure this information gets to people who will take it seriously and investigate properly. Over the following weeks, we contacted local law enforcement, state police, and even the FBI field office in our region. Most of these contacts resulted in polite but dismissive responses. Without concrete evidence or a specific crime to investigate, there was little that official agencies could or would do based on our report alone. But we also reached out to hiking forums, local outdoor clubs, and social media groups focused on wilderness safety. Here, our warnings found a more receptive audience. Other hikers shared similar experiences, adding details that supported our account and filling in gaps in the pattern of incidents. A picture began to emerge of organized predatory activity targeting remote hiking areas throughout our region. The voice mimicry was just one technique being used. Other reports mentioned false trail markers, deliberately damaged bridges and trail infrastructure, and evidence of camps hidden in areas where no camping was supposed to occur. 6 months later, a joint task force of state and federal law enforcement arrested 3 individuals who had been operating an elaborate scheme to rob and kidnap hikers in remote wilderness areas. They had been using military-grade electronic surveillance equipment to monitor hikers' conversations and then employing sophisticated audio technology to play back recorded voices in order to separate people from their groups. When the details of their operation became public, our experience finally made complete sense. We had encountered the early stages of a hunting pattern that had successfully victimized at least a dozen other hikers over a period of several years. Our escape had been successful not because we were particularly clever or brave, but because we had recognized the threat early enough to respond appropriately. The technology they had been using was indeed far more advanced than anything available to typical civilians. Military surplus equipment obtained through black market channels and modified for their specific purposes. Their operation had been sophisticated enough to avoid detection for years, and it might have continued indefinitely if they hadn't eventually targeted a group that included an off-duty police officer who recognized the tactical nature of what they were experiencing. Looking back, I realize how fortunate we were. The voices in the forest that day were not supernatural or unexplainable. They were human predators using advanced technology to hunt other humans in locations where victims would be isolated and vulnerable. Our instinct to flee rather than investigate had literally saved our lives. The wilderness remains a place of beauty and recreation for millions of people, but it's also a place where human predators can operate with relative impunity. The incident taught me that the most dangerous creatures in the forest are not bears or wolves, but the humans who have learned to exploit our assumptions about safety and isolation. I still go fishing with my friends, but we're more cautious now about remote locations. We inform multiple people about our plans, carry reliable communication equipment, and most importantly, we trust our instincts when something feels wrong. The voices in the forest that day were a warning that we were fortunate enough to heed in time. The memory of hearing our own voices calling to us from the darkness between the trees will stay with me for the rest of my life. Not because it was supernatural or mysterious, but because it was human intelligence turned toward predatory purposes, and because I now understand how easily it could have ended very differently for all of us.